welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And if you follow the news, particularly the sporting news, you know that the subject of athlete concussions is very much a topic of concern these days. So tonight, we are honored to have as our guest Dr. Dan Iorio, who is a specialist in primary care sports medicine. So, Dr. Iorio, thank you for coming here.
I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the state of knowledge. Now, concussions get a lot of press coverage, and you know that there are ways to spin stories and there are ways to spin them differently. So what actually is the state of understanding about concussions these days?
So currently there's a bit of a cavern between what is known and what is reported. For a long time, we paid little attention to concussion. It was something that was pushed off, not really paid close attention to. But we've had some increased understanding of its potential impacts, its potential seriousness. But we've also made some real leaps in terms of the long-term consequences and how common they are and who is really at risk for them.
Now, you mentioned before the show that you became involved in this area back in 2006, so 10 years ago, long before it became a topic of news coverage. What prompted you to start looking more closely at it?
Well, interestingly enough, I had a wonderful athletic trainer at the high school in which I have provided services, who, as myself, was rather frustrated with the injury. It's kind of a amorphous, difficult to wrap your hands around type of problem. And there was also a new book released, I believe it was actually released in 2007, that from a local Hersey graduate, as a matter of fact, Chris Nowinski, called Head Games. But prior to that, we had done some research on a program, a neurocognitive program, which is a computer-based program to test the functioning of a student-athlete's brain, to see if that gave us more insight into when they might be better capable and safer to return to participation.
And what had you seen? Had you seen that when kids came back at certain times, some were not able to perform, or they were more likely to get further injuries? What prompted you to think this was a problem that needed further examination?
So there were more than a dozen, somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 different guidelines offered on how to manage concussion as we go back into the early 20s. Real mishmash, poorly really supported in the medical literature. And what we started to see was some cohesion, some direction in how to better evaluate who is truly capable. We had, most of us followed a guideline where once a athlete was asymptomatic for approximately 7 days, that they were considered to be cleared and could return to play. And that worked for a number of folks, but didn't work for everybody. And the big issue is that if you return to participation and sustain a second injury while you're not recovered from the original, that's really when substantial damage can occur, right? So we see much longer recovery periods, which is not just disruptive to sports. Of course, it's very disruptive to their academics and to their lives in general. So that's really what drove us in that direction.
So you mentioned that 7 days was kind of the standard. So today, is that different? I mean, it must be different in some way, but you also mentioned before the show that concussions are very individualized.
They are. And in a kind of a ballpark figure, 80 to 90% of adolescent athletes, student athletes, will be recovered from their concussion somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 to 10 days. Some that may occur much earlier, and some it may occur at 7 to 10 days. That doesn't mean we return them to play right away. There's a few things we do differently these days. But then there's that 10 to 20% that have protracted symptoms. Those are the ones that we really need to identify and protect.
And how do you identify them? How do you know that 20%?
So the process of setting up a concussion management program first has to do with education. And it's education of the student athlete, of the coaches, of course of the parents, but even the teachers, the school district, the administrators, and the community as a whole, which there have been some great strides with the increased attention on concussion. So with that, the student athlete has been more willing and able to tell us, hey, I'm not feeling right. And then we have a series of evaluations we can do, including the use of a computerized neurocognitive test that will help us determine where they are in the recovery process. See, concussion is really, to try and simplify it, it's really a problem with the software, not so much the hardware. If you think of the brain as a computer, you don't really see anything abnormal on our standard medical imaging, be it CT scanning, MRI. They will, by definition, return negative or normal. So it's not been able, you'll find a normal neurologic examination. So we haven't been able to say, aha, here's the problem. We just need to watch this exam, and when that improves, they're ready to go. So this kind of in-depth look, putting them through a functional battery of tests, has actually given us that insight, and it works quite well. Not perfect, but quite well.
So it's interesting that you mentioned it's a software problem. That we, at least I think of the brain as being largely hardware, and that no matter what's happening in the brain, it's some sort of neural connection. There's neurons firing or not firing, and that seems to me it should be somehow measurable as physical activity. But you're saying that doesn't really show up on the scan.
Yes. So interestingly enough, over the years they have looked at EMGs, which were electromyograms, and EEGs and other studies to try and measure the electrical activity and potentials, and they have not been significantly abnormal as you would find in seizure or some other more damaging nerve injury. So that's what led to this somewhat laissez-faire kind of approach to concussion, which we felt it was largely a transient problem for decades. However, the cumulative damage, particularly of those who are returning to participation and getting an injury on top of an existing injury, that's really where the problems show up. And unfortunately, it's not measurable by these commonly used diagnostic techniques.
So this may be going a little too far afield, but just in thinking of brain science, what is that software? I mean, if we can't measure it, if we can't see it with any of our scans, well, what do we think it is?
So, well, the brain is obviously very complex, and I didn't train as a neurologist, but certainly as a primary care sports medicine and primary care physician, I have spent a lot of time studying it myself. It's a remarkably complex system with a great deal of redundancy, and we are appreciating more every day that there are certain elements that are moldable, neuroplasticity, things that can be recruited when other areas are injured. So the idea is, as far as the software versus hardware is concerned, yes, there's some disruption in the hardware, but there's an ability to work around in some circumstances. So in many circumstances, everything returns back to just its normal state. I frequently will use the analogy of a snow globe, where shake up the snow globe and you have all these flakes throughout the globe. Every flake needs to return back to its approximate original location for everything to kind of work normally. And until it does, the transmission of information, the processing what we call executive functioning, decision making, working memory, these sorts of things are altered, albeit subtly, and that's why it takes a functional exam testing those executive functions, and, as well as reaction times and some other things that can really give us insight that we haven't had from any other form of testing.
So how often would this battery test be administered? So to identify the 20% who don't get better in 7 to 10 days, is there a series of these tests? Do you conduct them throughout that 7 to 10 day period?
Right. So we test everybody. Not we start by getting baseline or pre-season studies, ideally, where somebody is not injured. And we do this at the school and at the youth football level as well. And we set them down, they take the test that is then their baseline. So if they're suspected of having a concussion.
And every player gets this baseline, right?
Yes, that's what we strive to do. And for a large part, we are able to do that. So the concept is then if they are injured, we compare their post-injury test to their pre-test, which can be very important when you have issues of, say, the child with a learning disability or with certain types of conditions such as migraine headache, mood disorders, attention deficit. Those types of things do impact the recovery. They also show up differently on this testing. So having a baseline can be very, very helpful, is very, very helpful. We usually try to get one done within 72 hours of the suspected injury. And the reasoning is that actually helps us and the school district prognosticate, meaning predict to some degree. It does give us an idea, how potentially involved the injury is and some insight into how long we can expect it to take to recover. And because it is, as a injury to the thinking part of the brain, it affects their schoolwork, it affects their testing, and they are, in fact, a categorized disabled class under the American with Disabilities Act. So we do.
So if you have a concussion, you're covered under the Disabilities Act?
Yeah, they do fall under that with the Rehabilitation Act as well from much years earlier, and they're a protected class, and so we institute specific accommodations so as not to inappropriately test them. So you don't want a student athlete with a head injury to have to sit down and take a final exam when they're not thinking in the manner they would normally. That's
it's not fair to the student.
Not fair to the student. It's just wrong. So so we've gone a long way working with the school district, the teachers, and others to develop systems of accommodation, and it's really been a huge benefit, I think, to our overall program. The students, especially these days with the pressures of school, the amount of material they're expected to absorb. I had a young fella, about 8 years ago, very high performer in school classes. He was in advanced placement and honors courses. And one of our recommendations after a concussive injury is not just physical rest, but actual cognitive rest, which means, you
let your brain take a break.
Exactly. There's inherently a energy imbalance that occurs when you have this injury. And if you're thinking and using your brain a lot, well, you don't have the ability to recruit the energy needed, and it causes symptoms and it prolongs recovery. So this young lad, despite our recommendations, tried his hardest to keep up. And he wasn't getting better, and we were out about 3 weeks, and I was like, this is unusual. I said, so what are you doing at home? And he says, well, I have been trying to keep up with my homework. And I said, let's give it a break, give it a rest. We'll make sure we check with your counselor and teachers. He took that week off, and as it turned out, by the next week he was symptom-free and all of his testing had returned to normal.
So it took a week of actual brain
Of
rest.
true rest, yeah.
I think that that's really such a remarkable concept, because if you're thinking, of course, there's blood flow, the neurons are firing, the brain is working.
Right.
Right.
So the best understanding, based on basic science models, is that this energy imbalance occurs when you have a concussion. So the brain ordinarily is able to auto-regulate and draw blood flow, and it uses strictly glucose as its source of energy. And when you have a concussion, it's unable to do that. It's unable to upregulate its blood flow. So you end up with a deficit, which causes both symptoms and prolongation of recovery. And the other side is true too. If you're physically active and you're exercising, trying to train, that sort of thing, well, your muscles in your legs and your diaphragm and so on are competing with the blood flow to the brain. You don't want that competition. You want the brain to win that every time. So so we encourage both physical and cognitive rest, and that includes things like texting and social media, and which can be a real challenge for some of our adolescents. But we've been, with the educational component, very successful in getting the vast majority of them to buy in. And
so what would you tell them to do during that week? Just
it's basically non-taxing problems, and it's very individualized. I mean, there are some students who are so symptomatic that it's really detrimental for them to go to classes, and they may have to spend some time at home
like
just resting.
In a darkened room, not doing much.
Right, not doing much. They might, have some mindless kind of TV or what have you that really doesn't take a lot of concentration. Listen to music, what have you. But the other side of it, and this really represents the majority, they do pretty well in school. They may get some symptoms. Our school is set up. The school nurses have been fabulous. They will allow the student athlete or the injured individual to come in, rest for a while in the nurse's office. We have some cots, and half hour, 45 minutes, they can go back and pick up on where they may have been. There is a problem with removing an adolescent from a social environment that I think has to be considered as well. Isolating somebody at home who's very much a social being is also a kind of it's the art of medicine. It's understanding that you're treating the whole person and not just an illness. And
I was thinking that very thing about particularly a student athlete who's very successful both academically and or athletically, these are generally pretty highly motivated people. Yeah. And if it's the quarterback who's having a great year, he wants to get back out there and do this right away. And I would imagine that's part of the challenge, is to convince them, no, you don't.
And it is a challenge, and I had encountered that as well once a number of years ago, where a young man who suffered a injury in a playoff game and was not open and wasn't obvious to any of us, wasn't apparently obvious to the coaches at the time. However, he went on to play and happened to win that game and went on to the next game. And we lost that game, and he came into me and he said, "Yeah, I haven't been feeling well. I took a hit in the game before." And we had a little conversation about that, but when I spoke with the coaches, I said, what was going on? Well, he was missing his checkdowns. He was missing his, I said, so guys, you got to communicate that to us. That's something that's not right. And honestly, with a couple of days of rest for that individual, he was literally back to himself. It was. So
if he'd taken that rest in between those two games, he might have been much sharper during that next
He
game.
may have been able to actually complete the return to participation protocol. So once a person is asymptomatic at rest or with activity, we begin a progression of activity before we release them back to play. So there's no set time, and we base it on the individual's response to our testing.
Now, one of the things you mentioned before the show that I thought was so interesting was that there was a time, 10 years ago or more, where it was felt that you know, people have tolerances to concussions, and that the guys who make it to the pros are the guys who can tolerate concussions, and if you can't, you just don't make it. But now, as you said, that thinking is changing somewhat.
It is. It's a challenging area, and the science is far from being settled. You know, certainly all of us who've worked in the area have seen those student athletes who we've said, you know, collision sports are not your
Not
thing.
for you.
You know, they are getting injuries with less and less force, and as a result, we recommend retirement from collision sports. However, there's those who, you know, keep on playing, and either they're not reporting or they don't appear to have the injury. And now we have this this conundrum, this uncertainty in terms of how is it that these pro players with repetitive injuries who tolerated them well throughout are now having these devastating
Like CTE and the
right, the
kind
chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which was popularized in the recent movie.
Right.
It's been around for a while. It's still not certain exactly how that happens. It has many of the same inflammatory proteins involved in it that we see in Alzheimer's disease, which is not felt to be a collision, you know, induced condition. So it's still not clear how that all works out.
And you mentioned that there are people who have these symptoms of CTE, like Dan Gifford, who died at the age of 85, but seemed to lead a perfectly normal life.
Right. So this is the other, you know, kind of uncertainty. We finally are getting comparators, people who went through the same lifestyle, professional athletics, made it to that level, played, went on to have successful careers, be it business or broadcasting in Dan Gifford's case and other business ventures, and who were kindly enough to donate their brains to science. And when they were looked at closely under the microscope, they did in fact have CTE, but they didn't have those really catastrophic and terrible things that we've seen with the likes of Junior Seau or Dave Duerson and others that we felt may be due to this condition. So that's something we have to try and explain. We certainly, it's less well understood today than it was felt to be just a few years ago.
Or less clear cut, let's
Exactly,
say.
yeah.
Well, I think it's the difference between scientific knowledge and press knowledge, right?
Yeah, and the problem with this is that we've seen dramatic decreases in athletic participation in our youth sports.
Across the board, even non-collision sports?
Absolutely, actually. It's a little perplexing, but the non-traditional sports such as hockey and lacrosse have seen increases, but we don't have a lot of data because they're not kind of sanctioned high school sports for the most part. But the high school sports, be it football, even soccer and some others, you've seen steady reductions. And in fact, we've had problems with you know, fielding teams. So now you see at some of the schools where they'll have a freshman, a JV, and varsity no longer have a sophomore team. So this is because of decreased participation, which, you know, I understand the concern, but it's based on an uncertainty in science, and there are tremendous benefits to sports participation. You know, there are things.
But you could get those, I mean, by going for non-collision sports, you know, baseball, basketball.
To some degree, yeah, I would agree to some degree you're going to get that in a lot of different competitive athletics. But there are certain things about getting knocked down and getting back up again that you don't learn from the other sports in quite the same way. As a person who played football and rugby for a lot of years, it was different. And so is that in our society's best interest, where we see this epidemic of pediatric obesity and some of the issues dealing with sedentary lifestyles, and what kind of long-term impact is that going to have on our health, our society's health? You know, I think we have to try and balance this all, and it's not so easy.
So there was a story I read, kind of at the height of the CTE coverage, that postulated that the pro football as a sport might wither away because of these issues of head injuries and cognitive disabilities later. and that parents would just not allow their kids to participate, and if you don't have the kids coming up, you don't get the pros, and so the sport as a whole withers. And the analogy they drew was to boxing, which used to be much more popular than it is today.
But it's been replaced by MMA, which is
even more
more brutal and more popular, I would argue, than boxing has been. So I think you know, for a lot of folks, it provides, especially athletes coming from underprivileged circumstances, it provides them an outlet, a way to, you know, advance themselves, and I think that would be a shame if that, you know, were to be the case. And I think we need a lot more information before we make solid, you know, statements or conclusions about what's going on there. You know, it's the sort of thing where there's going to be some that are terribly vulnerable to the injury. If we have a good system in place where we can educate the populace, be it the student athletes, the coaches, the parents, and so on, we identify an injury early, we protect that injured student athlete so that they do not receive a second injury on top of the existing, and they're able to return to play, or they show a tendency to get injured more easily. Well, if we are able to steward those athletes to other sports, I think it's in their best long-term interest, and I think the sport can continue. This is certainly an area of ongoing research.
Well, and what, I mean, we only have a few minutes left,
Right.
but I'm interested in this conundrum between the athletes, the professional athletes, the football players in particular, who have had these terrible cognitive disorders, and the ones who haven't. How is that research being conducted? How are people trying to figure out where that difference lies?
Well, in science, you know, we have several levels of evidence. We start out with what we refer to as case studies, which is taking an individual and explaining their circumstance. Then we have case series, which is what we've largely seen so far, where we have a series of individuals who had, you know, really catastrophic life experiences. Their brains were donated to science, and they found the CTE, and conclusions were made at that point without adequate comparators. In science, you need to have
a control group,
control group, and we're only now starting to see more of the control group. And so far, it's not clear that that's the case, that they're all going to end up following that pathway. And honestly, when you look at the sheer numbers, when you have, you know, 500,000 collegiate athletes, 7 million high school athletes, and several million youth athletes participating in these sports, and understand that football, based on National Athletic Trainer Association data, you know, we're looking at a 1.5 per 1,000 contact experiences, incidents of concussion, whereas in girls soccer it's 0.98. So where do we put the cutoff there, and how do we decide which sport is reasonable and which is not? So it's a challenging area.
Well, and that's perfect timing because we're just about out of time with the show. So, Dr. Iorio, thank you so much for being here. I've certainly learned a lot that I didn't know before you joined us on the show.
Well, I really appreciate you having me.
All right. And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night at 8 on Comcast Channel 19, and you can see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So, till next time, thank you and good night.